Continuing Aratus from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Nor was it twice or thrice, but very often, that like an obstinate lover, he repeated his attempts on the Aratus, and was so far from being discouraged by his disappointments that his missing his hopes but narrowly was an incentive to him to proceed the more boldly in a new trial. One time, amongst the rest, in making his escape through the Thracian plain, he put his leg out of a joint and was forced to submit to many operations with the knife before he was cured, so that for a long time he was carried in a litter to the wars. And when Antigonus was dead, and Demetrius succeeded him in the kingdom, he was more bent than ever upon Athens, and in general quite despised the Macedonians, and so being overthrown in a battle near Phalakia by Bethus, Demetrius's general, and there being a very strong report that he was either taken or slain, Diogenes, the governor of Piraeus, sent letters to Corinth, commanding the Achaeans to quit that city, seeing Aratus was dead. When these letters came to Corinth, Aratus happened to be there in person, so that Diogenes' messengers, being sufficiently mocked and derided, were forced to return to their master. King Demetrius himself also sent a ship, wherein Aratus was to be brought to him in chains, and the Athenians, exceeding all possible fickleness of flattery to the Macedonians, crowned themselves with garlands upon the first news of his death. And so, in anger, he went at once and invaded Attica, and penetrated as far as the academy, but then, suffering himself to be pacified, he did no further act of hostility, and the Athenians afterwards coming to a due sense of his virtue, when upon the death of Demetrius they attempted to recover their liberty, called him to their assistance, although at that time another person was general of the Achaeans, and he himself had long kept his bed with a sickness, yet rather than fail the city in a time of need, he was carried thither in a litter, and helped to persuade Diogenes, the governor, to deliver up the Piraeus, Lanakia, Salamis, and Sunium to the Athenians in consideration of 150 talents, of which Aratus himself contributed 20 to the city. Upon this, the Aeginetans and the Hamadeanians immediately joined the Achaeans, and the greatest part of Arcadia entered their confederacy, and the Macedonians, being occupied with various wars upon their own confines, and with their neighbors, the Achaean power, the Attalians, being in alliance with them, rose to great height. But Aratus, still bent on effecting his old project, and impatient that tyranny should maintain itself in so near a city as Argos, sent to Aristomachus to persuade him to restore liberty to that city, and to associate it to the Achaeans, and that, following Laodiadus's example, he should rather choose to be the general of a great nation with esteem and honor than the tyrant of one city with continual hatred and danger. Aristomachus slighted not the message, but desired Aratus to send him 50 talents, which might he pay off the soldiers. In the meantime, whilst the money was providing, Laodiadus, being then general and extremely ambitious that this advantage might seem to be of his procuring for the Achaeans, accused Aratus to Aristomachus as one that bore an irreconcilable hatred to the tyrants, and persuading him to commit the affair to his management, he presented him to the Achaeans. But there the Achaean council gave a manifest proof of the great credit Aratus had with them, and the goodwill they bore him. For when he, in anger, spoke against Aristomachus, his being admitted into the association. They rejected the proposal, but when he was afterwards pacified and came himself and spoke in its favor, they voted everything cheerfully and readily, and decreed that the Argives and the Phaeacians should be incorporated into their commonwealth. And the next year they chose Aristomachus general. He, being in good credit with the Achaeans, was very desirous to invade Laconia, and for that purpose sent for Aratus from Athens. Aratus wrote to him to dissuade him as far as he could from that expedition, being very unwilling that the Achaeans should be engaged in a quarrel with Cleomenes, who was a daring man and making extraordinary advances to power. But Aristomachus, resolving to go on, he obeyed and served in person, on which occasion he hindered Aristomachus from fighting a battle when Cleomenes came upon them at Pallantium, and for this act was accused by Aratus, and in coming to an open conflict with him in a contest for the office of general, he carried it by the show of hands, and was chosen general the 12th time. This year, being routed by Cleomenes near the Lacaeum, he fled, and wandering out of the way in the night, was believed to be slain, and once more it was confidently reported so throughout all Greece. He, however, having escaped this danger and rallied his forces, was not content to march off in safety, but making a happy use of the present conjuncture, when nobody dreamed of any such thing, he fell suddenly upon the Mantineans, allies of Cleomenes, and, taking the city, put a garrison into it, and made the stranger inhabitants free of the city, procuring by this means those advantages for the beaten Achaeans, which, being conquerors, they would not easily have obtained. The Lacedaemonians again, invading the Megalopolitan territories, he marched to the assistance of the city, but refused to give Cleomenes, who did all he could to provoke him to it, any opportunity of engaging him in a battle, nor could be prevailed upon by the Megalopolitans, who urged him to it extremely. For besides that by nature he was ill-suited for set battles, he was then much inferior in numbers, and was to deal with a daring leader still in the heat of youth, while he himself, now past the prime of courage and come to a chastened ambition, felt it his business to maintain by prudence the glories which he had obtained, and the other was only aspiring to by forwardness and daring, so that, though the light-armed soldiers had sallied out and driven the Lacedaemonians as far as their camp, and had come even to their tents, yet would not Aratus lead his men forward, but, posting himself in a hollow water course in the way thither, stopped and prevented the citizens from crossing this. Aratus, extremely vexed at what was going on, and, loading Aratus with reproaches, entreated the horse that together with him they would second them that had the enemy in chase, and not let a certain victory slip out of their hands, nor forsake him that was going to venture his life for his country. And, being reinforced with many brave men that turned after him, he charged the enemy's right wing, and, routing it, followed the pursuit without measure or discretion, letting his eagerness and hopes of glory tempt him on into broken ground full of planted fruit trees and cut up with broad ditches, where, being engaged by Cleomenes, he fell, fighting gallantly the noblest of battles at the gate of his country, the rest flying back to their main body and trebling the ranks of the fully armed infantry, and put the whole army to the rout. Aratus was extremely blamed, being suspected to have been betrayed Aratus, was constrained by the Achaeans, who withdrew in great anger to accompany them to Agium, where they called a council, and decreed that he should no longer be furnished with money, nor have any more soldiers hired for them, but that, if he would make war, he should pay them himself. This affront he resented, so far as to resolve to give up the seal and lay down the office of general. But upon second thoughts he found it best to have patience, and presently marched with the Achaeans to Orchomenus, and fought a battle with Megistonus, the stepfather of Cleomenes, where he got the victory, killing 300 men and taking Megistonus prisoner. But whereas he used to be chosen general every other year, when his turn came and he was called to take upon him that charge, he declined it, and Timoxenus was chosen in his stead, the true cause of which was not the pique he was alleged to have taken at the people, but the ill circumstances of the Achaean affairs, for Cleomenes did now invade them gently and tenderly as hitherto, as one controlled by the civil authorities, but having killed the Epors, divided the lands, and made many of the stranger residents free of the city. He was responsible to no one in his government, and therefore fell in good earnest upon the Achaeans, and put forward his claim to the supreme military command, wherefore Aratus is much blamed, that in a stormy and tempestuous time, like a cowardly pilot, he should forsake the helm, when it was even perhaps his duty to have insisted, whether they would or no, on saving them, or if he thought the Achaean affairs desperate, to have yielded up all to Cleomenes, and not to have let Peloponnesus fall once again into barbarism, with Macedonian garrisons, and Acro-Corinthus be occupied with Illyric and Gaulish soldiers, and under the specious name of confederates, to have made those masters of the cities, whom he had held it his business by arms, and by policy, to baffle and defeat, and in the memoirs he left behind him, loaded with reproaches and insults, and say that Cleomenes was arbitrary and tyrannical, yet was he descended from the Heraclita, and Sparta was his country, the obscurest citizens of which deserved to be referred to the generalship before the best of the Macedonians by those that had any regard to the honor of Grecian birth. Besides, Cleomenes sued for that command over the Achaeans as one that would return the honor of that title through kindnesses to the cities, whereas Antigonus, being declared absolute general by sea and land, would not accept the office unless Acrocorinthus were, by special agreement, put into his hands, following the example of Aesop's hunter. I don't know if I have that little red book. Well, not quite red, sort of a little orange a little bit. For he would not get up and ride the Achaeans, who desired him to do so, and offered their backs to him by embassies and popular decrees, till by a garrison and hostages they had allowed him to bit and bridle them. Aratus exhausts all his powers of speech to show the necessity that was upon him, but Polybius writes that long before this, and before there was any necessity, apprehending the daring temper of Cleomenes, he communicated secretly with Antigonus, and that he had beforehand prevailed with the Megalopolitans to press the Achaeans to crave aid from Antigonus, for they were most harassed by the war, Cleomenes continually plundering and ransacking their country, and so writes that Philarchus, who, unless seconded by the testimony of Polybius, would not be altogether credited, for he is seized with enthusiasm when he so much as speaks a word of Cleomenes, and as if he were pleading, not writing a history, goes on throughout defending the one and accusing the other. The Achaeans, therefore, lost Antinea, which was recovered by Cleomenes, and being beaten in a great fight near Hecatombaum, so general was the consternation, and they immediately sent Cleomenes to desire him to come to Argos and take the command upon him. But Aratus, as soon as he understood that he was coming, and was got as far as Lerna with his troops, fearing the result, sent ambassadors to him to request him to come, accompanied with 300 only, as to friends and confederates, and if he mistrusted anything, he should receive hostages, upon which Cleomenes, saying this was mere mockery and affront, went away, sending a letter to the Achaeans, full of reproaches, an accusation against Aratus, and Aratus also wrote letters against Cleomenes, and bitter rivalings. And railleries were current on both hands, not sparing even their marriages and wives. Speak truth when it comes to those things. Coming up with insulting things for people's family members and stuff like this is, Hereupon, Cleomenes sent a herald to declare war against the Achaeans, and in the meantime mixed very nearly of taking Sicyon by treachery. Turning off at a little distance, he attacked and took Pellena, which the Achaean general abandoned, and not long after took also Phenius and Ventelium. Then immediately the Argives voluntarily joined with him, and the Phaeacians received a garrison, and in short, nothing among all their new acquisitions held firm to the Achaeans. Aratus was encompassed on every side with a clamor and confusion. He saw the whole of Peloponnesus shaking hands around him, and the cities everywhere set in revolt by men desirous of innovations. Indeed, no place remained quiet or satisfied with the present condition, even amongst the Siconians and Corinthians themselves, many well known to have had private conferences with Cleomenes, who long since, out of desire to make themselves masters of their several cities, had been discontented with the present order of things, Aratus having absolute power given him to bring these to condign punishment, executed as many of them as he could find at Sicyon, but going about to find them and punish them at Corinth also, he irritated the people, already unsound in feeling and weary of the Achaean government. So collecting tumultuously in the temple of Apollo, they sent for Aratus, having determined to take or kill him before they broke out in open revolt. He came accordingly, leading his horse in his hand, as if he suspected nothing. Then several, leaping up and accusing and reproaching him with mild words and settled countenance, he bade them sit down, and not stand crying out upon him in a disorderly manner, desiring also that those who were about the door might be let in, and saying so, he stepped out quietly, as if he would give his horse to somebody, clearing himself thus of the crowd, and speaking without discomposure to the Corinthians that he met, and commanding them to go to Apollo's temple, and being now before they were aware, got near to the citadel, he leaped upon his horse, and commanding Cleopater, the governor of the garrison, to have a special care of his charge, he galloped to Sicyon, followed by 30 of his soldiers, and the rest leaving him and shifting for themselves. And not long after, it being known that he was fled, the Corinthians pursued him, but not overtaking him, they immediately sent for Cleomenes, and delivered up the city to him, who, however, thought nothing they could give was so great a gain as was the loss of their having let Aratus get away. Nevertheless, being strengthened by the accession of the people of the Acta, as it is called, who put their towns into his hands, he proceeded to carry a palisade and lines of circumvallation around the Acrocorinthus. But Aratus, being arrived at Sicyon, the body of the Achaeans there flocked to him, and in an assembly there held, he was chosen general with absolute power, and he took about him a guard of his own citizens, it being now 33 years since he first took a part in public affairs among the Achaeans, having in that time been the chief man to credit and power all of Greece. But he was now deserted on all hands, helpless and overpowered, drifting about amidst the waves, in danger on the shattered hulk of his native city, for the Italians, whom he applied to, declined to assist him in his distress, and the Athenians, who were well affected to him, were diverted from lending him any succor by the authority of Euclides and Micion. Now, whereas he had a house and property in Corinth, Cleomenes meddled not with it, nor suffered anybody else to do so, but calling for his friends and agents, he bade them hold themselves responsible for Aratus for everything. As to him, they would have to render their account, and privately he sent to him to Pallas, and afterwards Megistonus, his own stepfather, to offer him, besides several other things, a yearly pension of 12 talents, which was twice as much as Ptolemy allowed him, for he gave him 6, and all he demanded was to be declared commander of the Achaeans, and together with them to have the keeping of the citadel of Corinth. To which Aratus returning answer that the affairs were not so properly in his power as he was in power of them, Cleomenes, believing this a mere evasion, immediately entered into the country of Sicyon, destroying all with fire and sword, and besieged the city 3 months, whilst Aratus held firm and was in dispute with himself whether he should call in Antigonus upon condition of delivering up the citadel of Corinth to him, or he would not lend him assistance upon any other terms. In the meantime, the Achaeans assembled at Agium and called for Aratus, but it was very hazardous for him to pass thither, while Cleomenes was encamped before Sicyon. Besides, the citizens endeavored to stop him by their entreaties, protesting they would not suffer him to expose himself to so evident danger, the enemy being so near. The women also and children hung about him, weeping and embracing him as their common father and defender. But he, having comforted and encouraged them as well as he could, got on horseback, and being accompanied with 10 of his friends and a son, then a youth, got away to the seaside, and, finding vessels there waiting off the shore, he went on board of them, and sailed to Agium to the assembly, in which it was declared that Antigonus should be called in to their aid, and should have the Acrocorinthus delivered to him. Aratus also sent his son to him with the other hostages. The Corinthians, extremely angry at this proceeding, now plundering his property, and gave his house as a present to Cleomenes. Antigonus, being now near at hand, with his army consisting of 20,000 Macedonian foot and 1,300 horse, Aratus, with the members of the council, went to meet him by sea, and got unobserved by the enemy to Pega, having no great confidence either in Antigonus or the Macedonians, for he was very sensible that his own greatness had been made out of the losses he'd caused them, and the first great principle of his public conduct had been hostility to the former Antigonus. But perceiving the necessity that was now upon him, and the pressure of that time, that lord and master of those we call rulers to be inexorable, he resolved to put all to the venture. So soon, therefore, as Antigonus was told that Aratus was coming up to him, he saluted the rest of the company after the ordinary manner. But him he received at the very first approach with especial honor, and finding him afterwards to be both good and wise, admitted him to his nearer familiarity, For Aratus was not only useful to him in the management of great affairs, but singularly agreeable also as the private companion of a king in his recreations, and therefore, although Antigonus was young, and yet as soon as he observed the temper of the man to be proper for a prince's friendship, he made more use of him than of any other, not only of the Achaeans, but also of the Macedonians that were about him, so that the thing fell out to him just as the entity had foreshown in a sacrifice. For it is related that as Aratus was not long before offering sacrifice, there were found in the liver 2 gall bags enclosed in the same caul of fat, whereupon the soothsayer told him that there should very soon be the strictest friendship imaginable between him and his greatest and most mortal enemies, which prediction he at that time slighted, having in general no great faith in soothsayings and prognostications, but depending mostly upon rational deliberation. And at another time, however, when things succeeding well in the war, Antigonus made a great feast at Corinth, to which he invited a great number of guests, and placed Aratus next above him, and presently calling for a coverlet, asked him if he did not find it cold, and on Aratus's answering, yes, extremely cold, made him come nearer, so that when the servants brought the coverlet, they threw it over them both. Then Aratus, remembering the sacrifice, fell a-laughing, and told the king the sign which had happened to him, and the interpretation of it. But this fell out a good while after. And people do incorporate their what's going on, either the cold and warm reading of people and rumors into their soothsaying. And people tend to remember that, these Sibyls and Cassandras, the truths and stuff they say, but, they kind of dismiss some of the errors. And if they paid attention to that, the idea of labeling it as with spiritual authority actually is a sign that it's less common to be the, true than other sorts of analysis. But so Aratus and the king, plighting their faith to each other at Pega, immediately marched towards the enemy, with whom they had frequent engagements near the city, Cleomenes maintaining a strong position, and the Corinthians making a very brisk defense. In the meantime, Aristoteles, the Argive, Aratus' friend, sent privately to him to let him know that he would cause Argus to revolt, if he would come thither in person with some soldiers. Aratus acquainted Antigonus, and taking 1,500 men, I'm going to tunnel here, the distraction. Aratus acquainted Antigonus, and taking 1,500 men with him, sailed in boats along the shore as quickly as he could from the Isthmus to Epidaurus. But the Argives had not patience till he could arrive, but making a sudden insurrection, fell upon Cleomenes' soldiers, and drove them into the citadel. Cleomenes, having news of this, and fearing lest if the enemy should possess themselves of Argos, they might cut off his retreat home, leaves the Acrocorinthus, and marches away by night to help his men. He got thither first, and beat off the enemy, but Aratus appearing not long after, and the king approaching with his forces, he retreated to Mantinea, upon which all the cities again came over to the Achaeans, and Antigonus took possession of the Acrocorinthus. Aratus, being chosen general by the Argives, persuaded them to make a present to Antigonus of the property of the tyrants and the traitors. As for Aristomachus, after having put him to the rack, in the town of Cancrea, they drowned him in the sea, for which, more than anything else, Aratus was reproached, that he could suffer a man to be so lawlessly put to death, who was no bad man, but been one of his long acquaintance, and at his persuasion had abdicated his power, and annexed the city to the Achaeans, and already the blame of the other things that were done began to be laid to his account, as that they so lightly gave up Corinth to Antigonus, as if it had been an inconsiderable village, that they had suffered him, after first sacking Orchomenus, then to put into it a Macedonian garrison, that they made a decree that no letters nor embassy should be sent to any other king without the consent of Antigonus, that they were forced to furnish pay and provisions for the Macedonian soldiers, and celebrated sacrifices, processions, and games in honor of Antigonus, Aratus's citizens, setting the example and receiving Antigonus, who was lodged and entertained at Aratus's house. All these things they treated as his fault, not knowing that having once put the reins into Antigonus's hands, and let himself be borne by the impetus of regal power, he was no longer master of anything but one single voice, the liberty of which it was not so very safe for him to use, for it was very plain that Aratus was much troubled at several things, as appeared by the business about the statues, for Antigonus replaced the statues of the tyrants of Argos that had been thrown down, and on the contrary they threw down the statues of all those that had taken the Acrocorinthus, except that of Aratus, nor could Aratus by all his entreaties dissuade him. Also the usage of the Mantiaeans by the Achaeans seemed not in accordance with the Grecian feelings and manners, for being master of their city, by the help of Antigonus, they put to death the chief and most noted men amongst them, and of the rest, some they sold, others they sent, bound in fetters, into Macedonia, and made slaves of their wives and children, and the money thus raised, a third part they divided among themselves, and the other 2/3 were distributed among the Macedonians. And this might seem to have been justified by the law of retaliation, for although it be a barbarous thing for men of the same nation and blood thus to deal with one another in their fury, yet necessity makes it, as Simonides says, sweet and something excusable, being the proper thing in the mind's painful and inflamed condition, to give alleviation and relief. But for what was afterwards done to the city, Aratus cannot be defended on any ground, either of reason or necessity, for the Argives, having had the city bestowed on them by Antigonus, and resolving to people it, he, being then chosen as the new founder, and being general at that time, decreed that it should no longer be called Mantinia, but Antigonea, which name it still bears, so that it may be said to have been the cause that the old memory of the beautiful Mantinea has been wholly extinguished, and the city to this day has the name of the destroyer and slayer of its citizens. After this, Cleomenes, being overthrown in a great battle near Cilicia, forsook Sparta, and fell into Egypt, and Antigonus, having shown all the manner of kindness and fair dealing to Aratus, retired into Macedonia. There falling sick, he sent Philip, the heir of the kingdom, into Peloponnesus, being yet scarce a youth, commanding him to follow him above all the council of Aratus, to communicate with the cities through him, and through him to make acquaintance with the Achaeans and Aratus, receiving him accordingly, so manage him as to send him back to Macedon, both well affected to himself and full of desire and ambition to take an honorable part in the affairs of Greece. When Antigonus was dead, the Attalians, despising the sloth and negligence of the Achaeans, who, having learnt to be defended by other men's valor, and to shelter themselves under the Macedonian arms, lived in ease and without any discipline, now attempted to interfere in Peloponnesus, and plundering the land of Petra and Duma in their way, they invaded Messena and ravaged it, at which Aratus, being indignant, and finding that Timoxenus, then general, was hesitating and letting the time go by, being now on the point of laying down his office, in which he himself was chosen to succeed him, he anticipated the proper term by 5 days, that he might bring relief to the Ascendians, and mustering the Achaeans, who were both in their persons unexercised in arms, and in their minds relaxed and averse to war, he met with the defeat at Caphaa. Having thus begun the war, as it seemed, with too much heat and passion, he then ran into the other extreme, cooling again and desponding so much that he let pass and overlooked many fair opportunities of advantage given by the Attalians, and allowed them to run riot, as it were, throughout all Peloponnesus, with all manner of insolence and licentiousness. Wherefore, holding forth their hands once more to the Macedonians, they invited and drew in Philip to intermeddle in the affairs of Greece, chiefly hoping, because of his affection and trust that he felt for Aratus, they should find him easy-tempered and ready to be managed,